Sally Rodgers is really considered the mother of Article 20, Section 21. That's the current constitutional amendment that is focused on the importance of New Mexico legislators passing laws to control pollution and prevent despoilment of the natural resources and the environments of the state of New Mexico. It is the language that when Sally and her colleagues decades ago first put forth, thought would accomplish what a Green Amendment will accomplish in terms of really raising up and providing the most powerful constitutional recognition and protection to the environment and to the natural resources of the state of New Mexico. Unfortunately, and Sally now recognizes this, Article 20, Section 21 fell far short, both because of how it was written, where it was placed in the Constitution, and then consequently how it's been interpreted by the courts. And she sees the proposed New Mexico Green Amendment as accomplishing her original vision of raising up environmental rights and environmental protection to that highest constitutional level in the state of New Mexico. It was really powerful to be able to sit down with Sally Rodgers and hear about her hopes and her dreams and her original vision for Article 20, Section 21, how she learned that it has failed to accomplish that original vision, those original goals, but how a constitutional New Mexico Green Amendment could fill the void and provide the protection that she has long hoped for and strived for. So I hope people will take some time to listen to Sally, share her experience, share her vision, hear the history of Article Section 21, hear her put it in context, and hear her describe why, as an environmental activist and advocate in the state of New Mexico, she believes the proposed New Mexico Green Amendment is the pathway to the future.
My name is Sally Rodgers. I am the founder of the New Mexico environmental organization called Conservation Voters New Mexico. I started my activist life in 1968 while I was watching a Johnny Carson show, and he had a special guest on. I was nursing my baby girl, and that guest was Paul Ehrlich, and dots started getting connected in my head. The next day, I went out, I bought his book, I read it, I read all the books in the bibliography. I started the first ZPG chapter in the state of New Mexico, and then shortly thereafter that, I organized the first Earth Day in Santa Fe, and not long after that, when I realized there was no environmental activist voice in the New Mexico legislature, I thought to myself, okay, I can do that. Why not? It can't be too hard. And I've recently said it was hard. Not only were there no environmental voices in the state, the only women in the state capitol building were staff. There were no women legislators. There were no women lobbyists. It was just me. And there was no guidebook, there was no how-to book. I had to figure it out on my own. I'm pretty much self-taught.
So did you actually got elected to office?
No.
You just advocated in the hall?
Yes. When I went to my
part.
first session of the legislature, I was working for an organization that ultimately became Conservation Voters New Mexico. It was called the Central Clearinghouse, and I was the Central Clearinghouse lobbyist. That was my beginning, and that was 50 years ago.
So can you tell us a little bit about Conservation Voters New Mexico, what its mission is and how it goes about doing its work?
Yes. Conservation Voters New Mexico has achieved the mission that I began with at the Central Clearinghouse, which is holding legislators responsible for their votes, supporting and electing, with a very good track record most recently, of conservation, environmentally aware and educated legislators, and publishing that, making that available to everyone in the state. And they have succeeded, along with other environmental organizations, in achieving something that's not quite 100%, but it's infinitely more environmentally oriented and environmentally receptive than it was when I started 50 years ago. And because so many women have now been elected to the New Mexico legislature, we could be, thanks to CVNM, on the verge of having almost half of the legislature represented by women.
Can you tell me what you think today are the most pressing environmental issues that's facing New Mexico's environment, natural resources, and communities?
Yes. Global warming. And I personally prefer to call it global warming rather than climate change, because global warming is more descriptive. And years ago, one of these obscure facts, the term climate change was created by a Republican strategist who knew how to phrase things in such a way that they sounded less threatening, or alternatively phrasing things in a way to make them sound more threatening. So global warming became climate change.
What, right now when we look at...
There's another huge existential threat to New Mexico, and that is radioactive waste. And that is embodied by the Waste Isolation Pilot Project, also known as WHIP, and a proposal by a company called Holtec to essentially bring all the nation's high-level waste on and here's a lovely other lie in terms of verbiage, and that is temporary site until a permanent site is found. And that's, of course, absurd on the ground. And there are also moves being made in the state of New Mexico to expand the mission of WHIP, which originally was intended only to store transuranic waste that was a product of the Cold War. And I have been involved with WHIP before it became WHIP, when it was an idea, when the folks promoting nuclear power were looking for some place to put stuff. And they went to Kansas first, they looked at the salt mines, and then some folks in the southern part of the state who were having a then economic recession with the potash industry were sold a bill of goods that this would bring in jobs. And that particular dynamic has always been one that folks like us who care about our kids, our grandkids, our great-grandkids being able to have a planet to live on, have been battling the pretty much, in a way, real and yet artificial battle between economics and protection.
When we think about global warming and you look at energy creation, fossil fuel extraction here in New Mexico, do you think that New Mexico's state government is properly responding to the global warming crisis in how it's undertaking its work as a government.
I have to break that down, depending upon what part of government we're talking about. And within the separate divisions of government, the executive and the legislative and the regulatory, I mean, we could break it down that way. You really have to look at it that way, actually. What we mean by addressing it. And the simple answer is yes and no. The language, generally speaking, for the more progressive members of government is very concerned about climate change and doing something about climate change. But we kind of have to always look beneath that and see what's actually going on. And in some instances, it's not good. And in others, it's horrible. In some instances, it's encouraging, it's hopeful. It's complicated, pretty much the way addressing the issue is. But for people who care, for people who have the commitment to try and do something to help reduce greenhouse gases, to move us toward a carbon, to stop carbon numbers from escalating. One thing I like to remind people of, because most people don't know, is that when I started 50 years ago, we know that 350 is supposedly the magic number. When I started 50 years ago, it was below 350. We're above 400 now. I haven't checked today, but the last time I looked, I think it was 415. And the numbers are going to keep going up, not only because of carbon, but because, and especially for an oil and gas producing state that we need to be concerned about, it's methane.
When we think about the Holtec proposal and bringing radioactive waste from all over the nation to New Mexico for disposal, as you say, the characterization is temporary storage, absent a final plan. To me, it looks like disposal. And just want you to know, Green Amendments for the Generations and my Delaware Riverkeeper Network organization are on the record against Holtec, because some of that radioactive waste is going to come from the Delaware River, and if it's taken out of those facilities there, it's going to make it easier for those facilities that are slaughtering fish populations at the highest level in the nation, if not the world, by any nuclear power plant. They will then get some extra life. So it's, it's immoral and it's bad all the way around. I just want you to know that. But thinking about that, and thinking about the fact that, was it Senator Steinborn? Well, proposed some legislation that would have given the state a stronger place at the table when it came to that nuclear waste disposal proposal from Holtec. And of course it was rejected. I'm just wondering, when you saw that legislation proposed and as you saw it defeated, what were your thoughts and reactions?
So many. Well, that's a perfect example of looking at the specifics of government and whether appropriate actions are being taken. And across the board, it wasn't addressed. It would be wonderful if you could actually ask some very specific legislators in the leadership in New Mexico why they did what they did. And also the environmental organizations, their participation in their part, and what they their take is on why it happened and how it could succeed this time. There's a former legislator named John Heaton who is involved with a group called the Lee Eddy County organization. They've got all kinds of fancy names. Love Whip. They love everything radioactive. They love Holtec. They want it all here. Bring it all here. We don't care. Isn't denial an amazing thing? What we humans talk ourselves into when we don't want to learn the truth. Perfect example of denialism, one of the many. And where were the other areas of government involved in that bill? I mean, that would be a really good investigative journalism piece to pursue, I would think.
And just some broad, broad setting the stage kinds of questions here.
Sure.
When we look at New Mexico, there's a lot of diversity in this state, including, your standard white people, but a rich Native American community, Black community, Hispanic, Latino communities. Despite this rich diversity that seems to be really embraced as part of the culture and the community here in New Mexico, do you think that environmental racism is a problem here in the state of New Mexico in how the laws are implemented and how communities of color are impacted by environmental pollution and degradation?
Yes. Environmental racism is countrywide. It's nationwide. It's always been. Poor people, especially poor people of color, their communities have always been the chosen ones to locate things that people like me with white privilege and folks who have money don't want in their community. I like to recommend books because I'm a reader, and actually I'm a bit of a writer myself. And there is a book I wish everyone would read to really get a good set of facts about why that's true. The author is Jane Mayer, and it's called Dark Money. And of course, we talk about dark money in politics. You cannot divorce dark money from any aspect of society. And it's the Koch brothers, for instance. Once you know their story and how their money has essentially targeted poor communities of color for locations of toxic industries and waste, it's a decades and decades long history that's shameful. And yes, in New Mexico, many examples. But as I say, it's nationwide. It's everywhere.
So this is a broad brush question, but I want you to focus, when you think about the question and the answer, on the words properly protected. So when thinking about the statutes and the regulations here in the state of New Mexico, do you think New Mexico's laws are up to the task of properly protecting the environment?
No. And especially when it comes to regulation. Huge no. Something I want to ask you about, because I think it relates. If I'm jumping ahead, excuse me, but maybe we can tie it together.
It's all a conversation, so I'm good.
Okay. The New Mexico Constitution on environmental protection. I did a bit of research on it preparatory to our conversation, and I think it's worth folks knowing because some of the same issues then are the same issues now, in good ways and bad, in both good ways and bad. Our constitutional amendment was passed in 1971, which was my freshman year as the first woman lobbyist in New Mexico. And unfortunately, I was learning as I began, and I didn't know which it was important, what section of the Constitution our environmental protection Constitution should be to have real teeth. So I left it up to legislators to make that decision, and I think they probably left it up to staff. And so our Constitution is a good policy statement, but it really doesn't have teeth, and it needs to. But when I went back to look at the history of it, I want to tell you about the similarities, the things that are the same and the things that are different. It passed our state Senate unanimously, bipartisan vote. In fact, one sponsor was a Democrat and one sponsor was a Republican. And in those days, there were a number of Republican senators that were better than some of the Democratic senators when it came to environmental issues. But when the constitutional amendment, we pass things we call joint, they're starting in one house and they go to another. And then if they pass, it's put before the people for a vote, which by the way, had a huge favorability vote when it did go to before the public. But when it got to the House, there was a big chunk of opposition. And I looked back at who voted for it, who voted against it. And here's where the bad part of bipartisan come in. The no votes were both Democrats and Republicans. And so I did a bit more digging and called some of the legislators who were there that year with me and asked them to check their memory logs about what arguments there were against the amendment by both Democrats and Republicans. And actually the charge was led by Democrats, primarily Southern Democrats at the time, and they were all economic. The same fight happened then is happening now. Then the other thing I wanted to tell you about, in the event you don't know, have you ever heard of something called the Intermountain Oil and Gas BMP project?
No, tell me about it.
Well,
I can guess what it is, and I can imagine, but
well, this is almost a laugh out loud thing. Oh gosh, now I can't find the right piece of paper. Here we go. I'll just hold this up for the camera, but just a little visual here because I'm going to read from it. In this document called the Intermountain Oil and Gas BMP project, you know what BMP is?
Best management practices.
Yeah, best management practices. The title is New Mexico Laws. This section includes links to New Mexico statutes, regulations, guidelines, and policies related to oil and gas. Okay. It quotes New Mexico's environmental constitutional amendment. It has the text of it. And then it proceeds to list New Mexico oil and gas statutes, oil and gas regulations, oil and gas policy guidance, and the implication is that and then there's more. There's New Mexico air quality statutes and regulations, New Mexico water quality statutes and regulations, voluntary statutory remediation, and there's an implication in this document that they all flow from the New Mexico constitutional amendment. As I said, it's laugh out loud in terms of how ironically wrong and misleading it is. And then we go to this page, About Us. And About Us, it has links for the project partners and advisors, as they're called, that are in black. And I just want to read some of them. If you look at the whole list, you'd think, oh my gosh, there's people on here like Natural Resources Defense Council, New Mexico Game and Fish, the Montana Wildlife Federation, Rocky Mountain Clean Air Action. This has got some real information in here. You talk about disinformation. But if you look at the ones that are in black, they're colleagues and advisors. We have, I love this one, Environmentally Friendly Drilling Systems Program. Have you ever heard of them? I didn't have time to check them all out, but the Research Partnership to Secure Energy for America. WPX Energy, you know who they are, right? You see who else is interesting here. And then you've got the Upper Green River Valley Coalition, Rocky Mountain Mineral Law Foundation, Petroleum Field Services, LLC. And they quoted the New Mexico Environmental Protection Constitutional Amendment. So if that doesn't tell you that it needs to be strengthened, I don't know what else does. I don't have with me, but I will send you via email so that you will have an article about it. Has anybody been sending you New Mexico political reports?
Yeah, I'm getting those periodically.
Good. So there's been a recent article in New Mexico political reports about a recent regulation enacted by the Oil Conservation Division of Energy, Minerals, and Natural Resources that environmental groups have strongly objected to and have pointed out that you could drive a lot of oil trucks through. That doesn't really do anything. It purports to. Which reminded me, going back to this thing again, when it's talking about all these things, the last Democratic governor we had was Bill Richardson. And during his time in office, that particular department, and I worked there at the time, adopted something called the pit rule. And the idea behind the pit rule, it took maybe 2 years to develop it. It just went on and on and on, and everybody involved in any aspect of oil and gas were participants. And the whole idea was to protect the state's groundwater from unlined oil pits, so that stuff just couldn't be dumped and seep into the ground and you could never get it back out again. The next administration, the Martinez Administration, appointed an oil executive to run the department and put one of his staffers as head of the Oil Conservation Division. He, by the way, is a Trump appointee heading the EPA regional office in Dallas. give you some idea of what life was like back then for that particular agency. With the new administration, I want you to read that article. It would be better if you speak to it, because I don't have it in front of me and I want to be accurate about what I'm saying. But it's got loophole after loophole after loophole after loophole. And it's not going to get the job done. And then there are things that I learned during my time there that I have questions about if it ever was addressed, let alone fixed. And that is the number of oil and gas wells that the regulations say must be inspected by OCD personnel every year. I wish I had the numbers in front of me. I don't, but again, that's something to research and to look at. They're in the thousands. And then look at how many inspectors are employed by the state. And then look at how many vehicles they have to drive to get to those sites to do the inspections. And then look at how old they are. And then look at how many years and through how many administrations there have been requests to finance either the repair and maintenance of those vehicles or new vehicles. You'll be shocked, absolutely shocked. I mean, given the number of inspectors that they have, if they work 24/7, they could only inspect a small fraction that the statute says is their obligation to inspect. That's one example where if you start looking beneath the top level and you go down into the agencies and then you look at the divisions and then you look at the regulations and then you see the kind of support throughout government that it gets or it doesn't get, that gives you the full picture or a better picture. And then the other is I have questions that I don't have good answers to. And it has to do with WHIP. And as I mentioned, I've been involved in that project from its very beginning. And as I said, its intention was only to store transuranic waste and in a certain amount, and that it would have a lifespan. And that lifespan was in this decade. And the environment, the state's current environment department had the opportunity to implement that. It hasn't happened. And again, I will find things to email you where you will see that the federal government, under this administration, not only wants to extend the life of WHIP for another 50 years, which was never, ever its mission or its intention, as well as expand the kind of waste that would be allowed to be stored there. And they want to bring commercial. They want to bring high level. I'm trying to think of something that makes sense to compare it with. It's egregious. It's wrong. I don't have the appropriate sized comparison, but it kind of reminds me of other areas where somebody says, well, it's really okay now, but we know what the reality is. And all I can think about is what happened to the Voting Rights Act when its heart was gutted because, oh no, we don't have racism anymore in the southern states. So we'll just take the heart out of the act.
So when we talked about, and you said, noted that Article 20, Section 21 passed in 1971. I think it was November 2nd of 1971. So it's been 50 years. It's been 50 years, nearly. Having seen this provision in operation for the last 50 years, do you think that it's resulted in the kind of meaningful change that you anticipated, the kind of meaningful environmental protection action and activities by government that you had hoped for?
Simple answer is no, but I will tell you what has. And what has is citizen environmental activism. And as we talked about the growth and the change that we've seen in environmental organizations in the state, that's what's made the difference. Organizations like CB&M, who have worked to elect environmentally progressive legislators successfully, and how the composition of I could only dream 50 years ago that there might be something like an environmental caucus, or that the committees of the legislature that determine whether a good environmental bill passes or gets killed, or like the one on Holtec. Composition of the legislature is what determines whether a bill will pass or not. So what it really boils down to is having the right people in office.
So you gave a very striking example of how Article 20, Section 21 has been used by industry
Yes.
to advance their extractive goals.
Right.
Can you think of an example where Article 20, Section 21 has resulted in the same kind of powerful advancement for environmental protection? And I know that's a broad question, so...
It's a very broad question, and I don't know that I have the most complete answer, because my years in the roundhouse, I don't go there anymore. But I did for decades and decades. But during my time over there, you could ask other folks, but I don't remember anyone on a good environmental bill, a protective bill, ever citing it, ever saying, because this is in our Constitution, I'm proposing this legislation. I can't think of an instance, again, in my time, that ever happened. Or a publication like this one that says, because this is in our Constitution, we are proposing X.
So let's now, let's turn to the idea of advancing a green amendment, right? A provision added to the Bill of Rights section of the Constitution that recognizes and protects the rights of all the people of New Mexico, including future generations, to pure water, clean air, a stable climate, and healthy environments, as well as the natural, scenic, cultural, and healthful values of the environment, and recognizes and instills a duty on all government officials emanating from the state government, right, the town council, all the way to the legislature and the governor, to act as trustee of those natural resources and to protect them, to conserve and maintain them for the benefit of all the people. Do you think that this will provide a more meaningful and powerful platform on which to advance environmental protection here in the state of New Mexico?
Oh, obviously, but let's look at the range of mountains to be climbed to get there. So I have some questions of you. Do you know if, and I don't have the answer, but we could find out, if any of the environmental advocacy groups addressed this issue when they were doing questionnaires to candidates running for office. Do you know if any of them included that?
So we certainly have reached out to the environmental organizations, including CVNM and Sierra Club, who do those kinds of questionnaires to educate them about the Green Amendment. Whether they ultimately included it in their questionnaire, I don't know. What I do know is that it is part of the Democratic platform.
Okay. And has anybody done a head count among Democratic legislators?
So that's all the action and activity and engagement that's happening right now. And again, that's part of the ramifications of COVID, is that I haven't had the opportunity to have the kind of in-person meetings necessary. Working with the National Caucus of Environmental Legislators, we have been doing a lot of outreach to legislators, and also working with our legislative champions, including or encouraging, securing outreach. So we've been following a number of pathways to accomplish that. There is, but we haven't, there hasn't been, it's premature to do a head count because there hasn't even been a formal proposal. That is right now in the works, and it will be coming soon. But there's a step or two to go. The language is just now, I think we've just finalized it, just given feedback for that to be finalized. And so that should be forthcoming, and I think that that's when we're going to be able to do that, because you can ask somebody what they think about a concept. You can't ask them how they're going to vote about a concept. They have to actually see the language. So can you said that a Green Amendment, that you see that should be a strong tool for advancing environmental protection. Can you talk a little bit about how and why you think that, in light of the history of Article 20, Section 21? Right? They're fundamentally different, as we talked about, in placement and language and scope. But maybe if you want to speak intentionally to that difference, and or why you think the Green Amendment concept is in fact going to accomplish that original vision that one may have hoped for from Article 20, Section 21, which hasn't been achieved.
Well, as the Intermountain Oil and Gas BMP project illustrates, intention is everything. And you have to have language that will make intention reality. And there has to be a legal framework that's an unchallengeable legal framework. And the Constitution should be, and for some things is. And I'll give an example of a constitutional amendment that was done the right way, and the changes that it has created in the state of New Mexico. And I also want to tell you a bit of this history, not only for the state of New Mexico, but for anyone watching this in another state. Give it a try. And that is, New Mexico has its own Equal Rights Amendment. As you know, the federal Equal Rights Amendment fell short, thanks to Philip Schlafly and others. But we in New Mexico passed our own Equal Rights Amendment when all of that was going on at the national level. And in fact, the legislators that were proactive in helping the environmental constitutional amendment are the same ones that are the reason why we have an Equal Rights Amendment in New Mexico. That changed everything. Every statute at that time that existed, every statute had to be gone through and changed to reflect equal rights. And more recently, the New Mexico Supreme Court used that constitutional amendment as the basis for rights for the LGBT community. So when you have something in the Constitution that has bite, you make changes. And in the day when the Equal Rights Amendment passed, New Mexico Equal Rights Amendment passed, a woman couldn't get a credit card without a man's approval. The differences it made in women's lives was just phenomenal. You couldn't have your own credit. That's the comparison I want people to understand. We have an example in New Mexico of a change in equal human rights. Now we're talking about environmental natural rights, although there is still one to go, and that is the same equal rights that were extended to women, to genders, needs to be applied for poor people, especially poor people of color. We don't have that in this country yet.
Do you see the proposed Green Amendment that would constitutionally require equitable treatment of all people when it came to environmental rights and environmental protection as helping to advance environmental justice in the state?
Oh, yes. I mean, we could never separate racism from any activity that affects nature.
Do you think environmental rights should be a bipartisan issue?
Oh, yes. I mean, to me, that is one of the great, terrible outrages and sadnesses of current times, is that it needs to be bipartisan. There are good Republican environmentalists. They're just not in power. As I said, 50 years ago, I could name the names, and for people that are still around, there aren't very many of us going back that far, they would recognize it. They had better environmental ethics than some Democrats. It shouldn't be a partisan issue. We're all humans. Same species.
So in some other states, like New Jersey and New York, we actually do have bipartisan support. In fact, the prime sponsors in the Senate in New Jersey, as you noted about in New Mexico's history, in New Jersey, the prime sponsors are a Democrat and a Republican.
Oh, that's wonderful. That takes me back in the day.
Do you think that we can hope for, expect, anticipate some strong bipartisan leadership here in the state of New Mexico?
That goes back to another answer. What's it going to take? It's going to take more education. And it's going to take the right people getting elected to office and support from any given community for protecting the environment so that it is possible to have a bipartisan representation in environmental issues.
What do you want New Mexico legislators to know and to think about in terms of why a green amendment would be a good idea here in the state of New Mexico?
I want every legislator, every person in government, regardless of in what office they are, to think about global warming, to think about the numbers, to think about the science. When I started 50 years ago, I remember being told we had decades of time. Every time scientists tell us how much time we have left before we reach that point of no return, before we fall off the cliff, when we have irreparably changed all possibilities. It gets shorter. Every year it gets shorter. Gosh, what was it? A couple of years ago we had 20, then 10, then 15, then 12. Now we're talking in terms of a decade. We don't have time for anything incremental. We don't have time for anything gradual. If we don't do what needs to be done now, we don't want. I can tell you horror stories about what the future's going to be, but you probably don't want to hear those stories.
Do you think a green amendment would provide legislators the foundation they need to act swiftly and proactively to avert the worst ravages of global warming?
Yes, it would help, but as importantly, their constituents need to know that. The voters need to know that. And that's again where the importance of advocacy comes in. And yes, elected officials can be leaders and elected officials can be educators, but the people need to be educated, and whoever and however that needs to happen. I have friends, just to give you one example, this is very personal and it's a small thing, but I think you can extrapolate it out much bigger, and that is, I have a dear friend who is often feels remorseful about climate's changing and global warming, and well, what can I do besides not drive my car so much? I mean, it's things like, it depends on what you eat. If you're a big meat eater, people having an understanding of terms that you and I deal with all the time, things like a carbon footprint. What is your carbon footprint? How do you calculate that? How do we get that message to everybody in every neighborhood, people who vote, people who become legislators and vote? What is your carbon footprint? How do you calculate it? What do you need to know to be able to do that? That's the kind of educational, grassroots stuff I'm talking about.
And what would you say to those who you expect will oppose advancing a constitutional right to a healthy environment for all people, a green amendment here in New Mexico? What do you want the anticipated opposition to know, to hear, to reflect on?
I can't even begin to tell you how many times I've had conversations in my own head about what it would take for them to know what I know, what it would take for them to understand what the importance of a green amendment. And what I keep coming back to is I don't have an answer. I want to know what it will take for them to understand it. I would have questions of them. Why don't you understand? What information do you need to have to hold? Just take a piece of what's going on in global warming, just one piece of it, and ask them what it would take for them to get it. I don't have that answer. I think one of the things that all of us should be doing is working on that question and those answers, and doing our best to engage people that we know are going to, well, like the guy from the Lee County Alliance. What is it besides the usual about money and jobs and all the things that'll be lost? I wish I knew. I don't. I think it's going to take all of us thinking out loud and having these kinds of conversations to be able to find a way. And of course, this is just an obvious thing, but what that speaks to is the horrific divide of extremities in everything. We really, really need to work on, do we have any little bit of common ground? What do you think our common ground is, all you folks who don't think this is a good idea? Where is our common ground? Where can we start to at least have a conversation and see where we can find that common ground? Because the way we make change is to broaden that common ground. We don't have it right now.
And what would you say to somebody who said, well, environmental rights doesn't belong in the Bill of Rights section of the Constitution. Maybe put it somewhere else. But don't put it on par with the rights to free speech and freedom of religion and gun rights.
Do you have a right to breathe? Is that a right?
Not in America. Only in Pennsylvania and Montana. Well, you have a right to breathe, yes, but not clean air.
I mean, I'm asking you,
Yes.
you hypothetical person,
Yes.
you. Do you have a right to breathe? Do you have a right to be able to eat and drink and think you're not poisoning yourself? Do your children have that right? And wait for the answer and see. I suppose that would be the question to ask.
And is there anything that I haven't asked you, or any point that you would like to make, or poignant story or message that you want to make sure that you get an opportunity to speak to?
Give me a sec.
Yeah.
This is too good. Yes. It's a point I would like to make. 2 points. I encourage everyone who thinks they have a right to breathe and thinks they have a right to clean water and think that the creatures with whom we share the earth have a right to exist, that we have a right to expect to have clean rivers and clean oceans that aren't filled with plastic, the plastic will outnumber the fish in very short order if we don't make some big changes. I would encourage them to ask themselves, when they don't have answers, why? Why did this happen? Why did that person take that position? Especially if it's opposing my right to clean air and drinking clean water. And when they ask that why, to become their own investigator with this call to themselves and to their friends. Because I promise you, when they follow this question and they find the answers, they will find the answers. And that is what I want you to do when you're puzzled about something that happened that shouldn't have happened. Follow the money. Who made it? From whom was it taken away? follow the money. And read that book I told you about, Jane Mayer's Dark Money.